or other kinds of problems. We maybe even think of their huge power as being a plus because we know that the scale of these challenges are so big and we feel so powerless and frustrated about the ability of our government systems to actually solve them that we start to sort of put our faith in corporations. But of course, in the process of doing that, we're going further down the path that led us here.
I grew up in the 1950s, and at that time, there was a sense that our society would continually progress towards greater equality, greater opportunity, that there would continue to be social mobility for those at the bottom. The average pay for a CEO in the 1950s was 20 times that of the average worker. Today, the average pay of a CEO is 270 times that of the average worker.
In some cases, that gap is much greater. For example, Jamie Dimon makes more than 1,000 times the salary of one of his lowest paid employees.
Mr. Dimon, you're an expert on financial statements and you run a $2.6 trillion bank. I went to Monster.com and I found a job in my hometown of Irvine at JP Morgan Chase. It pays $16.50 an hour.
This is U.S. Congresswoman Katie Porter providing an example of a hypothetical employee, a single mother working as a teller at one of Jamie Dimon's banks.
She rents a one-bedroom apartment. She and her daughter sleep together in the same room. In Irvine, California, that average one-bedroom apartment is going to be $1,600. She spends $100.
Congresswoman Porter itemized typical monthly expenses and showed they greatly exceed the employee's salary.
My question for you, Mr. Dimon, is how should she manage this budget shortfall while she's working full-time at your bank?
I don't know that all your numbers are accurate. That number is generally a starter job.
She is a starting employee. She has a 6-year-old child.
Okay,
This is her first job.
You can get those jobs out of high school, and she may have my job one day.
But the widening gap between CEOs and their employees is just one symptom of rising inequality more generally.
Right now in the United States, the richest country on the planet, half of American families couldn't pay a $400 bill that landed on their doorstep without going into debt or selling something. That's because corporate executives and corporate lobbyists are constantly able to change the rules of the game in the favor of the people who are already wealthy and powerful, making it harder to form a union, making it easier for mega corporations to shut out competition from smaller businesses, slashing the taxes on wealthy people and corporations and shifting more of the responsibility on working class people.
The result is economic inequality. It's a real moral outrage, and it can't be dealt with separate from race and gender. You can't really deal with these inequalities separately because they're all so interwoven.
The black and brown people who are impacted by police brutality, women who are impacted by sexual harassment in the workplace, the enormous numbers of workers who are struggling with poverty and homelessness and all the degeneration that we see under capitalism for no fault of theirs. We're talking about a global economy that, for all the wealth that was generated last year, $1 trillion of that new wealth went to just 500 individuals.
I know you have a lot
I'd love to call her up and have a conversation about her financial affairs and see if we can be helpful.
See if you can find a way for her to live on less than the minimum that I've described.
Just be helpful.
The 1% and 0.01% is a group of folks who talk an extraordinary game and also act an extraordinary game of trying to help out in an age of inequality, and who are willing to do absolutely anything to help, except stepping off the backs of the working people of this country who have been screwed and passed over by 4 decades worth of change.
There's a great quote that was attributed to Justice Brandeis that said, you can have democracy or you can have large accumulations of wealth, but you can't have both. That wealth gives them a tremendous amount of power, both in promoting our political leaders, in promoting a legislative agenda, in every aspect of our society.
If I want to run a campaign that is entirely funded by corporate political action committees, is there anything that legally prevents me from doing that?
No.
So now I'm elected, now I'm in, I've got the power to draft, lobby, and shape the laws that govern the United States of America. Are there any limits on the laws that I can write or influence?
There's no limit.
So there's none. So I can be totally funded by Big Pharma, come in, write Big Pharma laws, and there's no limits to that whatsoever.
That's right.
Is there anything preventing me from holding stocks, say, in an oil or gas company, and then writing laws to deregulate that industry and potentially cause the stock value to soar and accrue a lot of money in that time?
You could do that.
Yes.
Okay, great.
I think we've seen the disappearance of independent governments with the rise of corporate rule. We have seen more and more takeover of government, takeover of electoral processes.
The problem is a corporate system and a political system where governments see their main role as facilitating private corporations to basically do whatever the hell. Nothing more starkly illustrates this than our federal treasurer picking up a lump of coal and carrying it around Parliament House.
Mr. Speaker, this is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The Treasurer knows the rule on crops.
It's coal. Mr. Speaker, those opposite have an ideological, pathological fear of coal. Affordable energy is what Australian businesses need to remain competitive.
This is Scott Morrison. He later became Prime Minister. He heads a group of high-level politicians with deep ties to major coal companies. Take note of this one, Adani. We'll return to it later. What's happening in Australia is just one part of a larger global story.
It's become accepted that corporations are in charge. Governments are incredibly subservient to corporate rule.
In the United States, we've seen under the Trump administration the wholesale corporate takeover of government on a scale with no historic precedent. It's beyond the wildest dreams of the corporate sector, especially in the area of deregulation.
I pledged to eliminate 2 unnecessary regulations for every 1 new regulation. We have succeeded beyond our highest expectations. Instead of 2 for 1, we have cut 22 burdensome regulations for every 1 new rule.
I'm willing to bet that those are made-up numbers. But the issue in regulation or deregulation is not the number. I mean, that's really absurd. What you want to know is, do you want to have another financial crisis? Well, if you do, let's get rid of the financial regulations.
Corporations have said repeatedly, we are responsible now. We understand the public interest, so we don't have to be regulated. We can self-regulate.
Well, they've got an obvious self-interest in saying that. The reason they can't self-regulate is that that's not what they're about. They're about trying to make profit. Routinely, when government regulation fails, companies in the pursuit of profit endanger people. And that's not a hypothetical. It means people get poisoned. They get diseases. They get sick. Corners will be cut, and people will be injured, and people will be killed. We see it over and over again.
every industry has fought regulation. They all resist oversight by the government because regulation increases their cost of operating. But I've never seen an industry that's fought it more than the oil and gas industry.
Remember this? This too was a consequence of deregulation. As a result of the Deepwater Horizon catastrophe, nearly 200 million gallons of crude oil spilled into the Gulf of Mexico, making it one of the worst environmental and deregulation disasters in history. But deregulation wasn't the only problem. BP was also recklessly breaking the law. And they're not alone in being corporate lawbreakers.
Corporations will certainly do things that are wrong, that are unethical, if they're legal and permissible. And all the empirical evidence says that they will also violate the law routinely, either intentionally or because they'll just go over the lines if there's profits to be made.
This opioid crisis is a killer, and it's a killer that does not discriminate.
Lives are being destroyed as corporations profit from their playbook moves, as they play to win.
These corporate forces have no limits, and these forces have put the very human species itself at risk.
Giant ecocidal corporations, they're literally playing casino with life on the earth. Their logic of profits, their process of profits, is the death of nature.
Whenever you mess with nature, you don't know for sure what the exact impact will be.
We chop down forests, we bring livestock into new regions, and we spread these new diseases. We're at the source of this problem.
Major cities all around the world are vulnerable to a disease arriving in the city and then causing a major epidemic. And again, we're seeing that more and more.
The rate at which new disease epidemics are originating, many of them moving from forests and wild species to humans, is partly because of corporate invasions into ecosystems and violence to animals. The attack on other species is bouncing back as an attack on us.
All of Italy is now effectively a red zone.
Warnings from Sao Paulo are dire.
In the United States, disaster has been declared in all 50 states.
When the coronavirus hit in the spring of 2020, it laid bare the unjust and dangerous fault lines of corporate capitalism.
African Americans have been hit hardest by the virus. Despite accounting for 14% of Michigan's population, they represent 41% of its COVID victims.
I'm praying that it's not. I haven't been in contact with nobody that has.
We got a possible COVID 52-year-old male, 10 minutes out, HFD.
I'll be honest with you, I can barely keep track.
This is the culmination of decades of tilting policy tilting public resources in favor of the biggest corporations. Fewer hospitals, fewer hospital beds, less capacity to be able to respond in an emergency like this. Other systems are also breaking down right now. Essential workers, people who are on the front lines of getting our groceries to us, are really putting their lives on the line without any kind of real backing from the companies that employ them. This is partly the product of the absence of labor protections, unions, and so on. What we're seeing is a continuation of the ways that corporations have undermined ordinary people's ability to have any say over their lives.
This is actually not a crisis full of novelties. It's a crisis full of revelation. For example, the same exact dynamic of the 2008 financial crisis bailout, where the most powerful gained power as a net result of those bailouts, that is literally happening again, maybe worse.
As ordinary people suffered the despair and harsh effects of economic breakdown, giant corporations were thrown a lifeline.
Madam President, I have an update. At last, we have a deal.
What did the Senate majority fight for? One of the largest corporate bailouts with as few strings as possible in American history. Shameful. The greed of that fight is wrong for crumbs, for our families. And the option that we have is to either let them suffer with nothing or to allow this greed and billions of dollars, which will be leveraged into trillions of dollars, to contribute to the largest income inequality gap in our future.
Once again, the very wealthy, big corporations did extraordinarily well. Over the last year and a half, they've spent over $1 trillion buying back their shares of stock to artificially boost their share prices so that the top executives and major investors would benefit. They could have used that $1 trillion as a cushion against the big rainy day, the storm that we now have. They didn't. Instead, they got bailed out. It's socialism for the rich, corporate socialism, but also the harshest form of capitalism for most working people and the poor.
The crisis is highlighting that we're absolutely unprepared to deal with disasters like what we're facing right now. And we also have this other, even bigger looming crisis, which is the climate catastrophe. That's not going anywhere.
It's no exaggeration to say that the greed economy is killing us. It's killing off species. It's depleting our natural resources. It's poisoning our people. A handful of corporations are allowed to put next quarter's profits ahead of the next generation. When our children and grandchildren look back in the history books and ask the question, why didn't we stop the crisis of climate change? The only answer we'll have for them is that it was profitable for a handful of corporations to keep polluting our planet.
The changes that we feared are coming faster than anybody thought. The impacts from them are going to be far worse than we thought. It's also going to change the entire global dynamic around equality. The world is going to divide in ways that we have a difficult time imagining now. We're headed for a world that sees a protected, privileged few surrounded by an immensely impoverished majority of the global population.
With the impacts of climate change now in plain view, fossil fuel companies have stopped actively denying that it's happening.
They they've discovered that a better strategy for them now in the age of active climate breakdown is to charm us all into believing that they're part of the solution. Saying, okay, we're going to invest in renewables, but meanwhile, we have to keep using fossil fuels for a long time. So, we can use lighter fuels like natural gas, but we have to be realistic.
It is impossible to displace carbon fully for a very long time. Gas is a very good carbon fuel.
You have to see this as one more arrow in the large quiver of delay tactics and ways to preserve what's really the core of their business, not the core of the best interest of society. We need to transition to the cleanest form of carbon-free energy as quickly as possible. If we were to do this by tomorrow, it wouldn't be fast enough.
I mean, we'd just be stupid if we look to the coal and gas and oil industry for a clean energy future. That's not what they do. They have a business model. They're going to pursue that business model to the end of time. And they may do that if we're not able to control them.
The fossil fuel industry actually doesn't plan to stop increasing production and increasing extraction anytime soon. In fact, they're doubling down on it. Their goal is to extract as much as possible before it becomes just completely unviable for them to do so.
The fossil fuel industry is ramping up new mega projects. Some companies are pursuing profits from even the dirtiest fuels, like Adani.
Around 2011, there were plans for 9 new coal export ports up and down the Great Barrier Reef coast. Adani's proposed Carmichael mine would be a 60 million tonne a year thermal coal mine in the middle of the Galilee Basin.
It's the largest new proposed coal project in the world, to be 40 kilometres by 13 kilometres, entirely encompassed within Wanganna-Jagalingou country.
It is on the doorstep of the Great Barrier Reef, an already very stressed and vulnerable ecosystem. And what we're going to see is 500 more coal ships every year trudging through a stressed reef that what scientists are telling us is already half dead.
The Adani Carmichael mine would drive global warming. It would destroy habitat for endangered species. It would destroy groundwater. And it would disenfranchise Wanganna-Jagalingou traditional owners of that country.
Wanganna-Jagalingou, we're a problem for Adani. So they got to do whatever they can to try and get rid of that problem. We know that the mechanisms of the state line up to work for mining companies and corporations, essentially to roll over Aboriginal people, to get past us.
The government and the state and the corporations devise ways saying, oh, we want to put this mine in, we just want to do it, we just want to put this pipeline in, and oh, these people are in our way, we need to remove them. They use security, they use our own Aboriginal police against us, they use every means they can.
To Indigenous people, it is clearly a life and death struggle. That's what you're witnessing happening around the world, this destructive corporate agenda that is completely out of control.
Begins to understand that that good job that they had or their parents had is never coming back. That they are going to be working 70 hours a week and still be consumed by crippling debt payage. That all of their dreams that Oprah and everyone else has told them can come to fruition are never going to arrive. And they scream for vengeance and moral renewal, and they look for the internal enemies that have thwarted the possibility of their own aggrandizement. So then you turn on the vulnerable. You turn on Muslims, undocumented workers, homosexuals, feminists, intellectuals, liberals. All of those forces that you are told have thwarted the possibilities that were your right to have.
What you see is a frustration that grew out of economic disempowerment, turning into a new wave of hate.
There's no question that a lot of people around the world have a feeling that we've lived in this age that is incredibly abundant in innovation, but short on progress, if progress means most people's lives getting better.
I'm right-wing and I'm proud of it!
It's only a matter of time before people want to shatter the system.
You must disperse now. Riot control agents will be used in this area.
There's no guarantee when people rise up to shatter a system, whether you get Medicare for all or a wall on the southern border.
It's akin to the fascist movements of the 1920s and 30s, where the alienated can feel a sense of empowerment by identifying with the great leader, often in these big rallies.
There's a group out there, just throw them the hell out.
I mean, it really is like snapshots out of the 1930s. This kind of politics of hatred and reaction and division.
Fuck Islam! Fuck them!
Donald Trump wasn't the problem. Donald Trump was the symptom of the problem. The problem is a breakdown in the social cohesion that makes democracy and civil society possible. And that breakdown in social cohesion in turn was created by 40 years of rising economic inequality, by the evisceration of the middle class. Collectively, the nation lashed out by electing the candidate who was lashing out too.
This angry right-wing eruption completely agreed with the free market fundamentalism of this new order and represented themselves as a people whose whiteness, whose traditional values, whose Christianity, whose nativism should be at the heart of the country's concerns.
Let them call you racist.
Laissez-vous appeler raciste.
Let them call you xenophobes.
Mais laissez-les vous appeler xénophobes.
Let them call you nativist.
Laissez-vous les appeler nativistes.
Wear it as a badge of honor, because every day we get stronger and they get weaker.
Parts of the population are actually leaning towards strongmen. Donald Trump, the large part of the Turkish population is supporting Erdogan, or we're seeing it in Hungary with Orban.
We are proud to stand together with the United States on fighting against illegal migration, on terrorism, and to protect and help the Christian communities all around the world.
All of these right-wing regimes represent a continuation of privatization, of the destruction of welfare, the undermining of labor unions, etc., unchained by the kinds of restrictions that workers' rights posed, or that environmental protections posed, or that even structures for providing for the poor posed. So now corporations have freer reign.
Money has replaced the vote. America is dominated by a system of legalized bribery. Our three branches of government are wholly captive to corporate power. So you have corporate forces that purport to pay fealty to electoral politics, the Constitution, the iconography and language of American patriotism, and yet internally have rendered the citizen impotent. I don't think that you can honestly grasp the forces we're up against, including the unraveling of the ecosystem, and not be filled with despair. The greatest existential crisis of our time is to at once understand the reality before us and then find the capacity to resist.
So much of our lives is about the stories we tell ourselves. And corporations have done a very effective job at defining the limits of possibility and defining what we can expect out of life. So if we believe that we are in a dog-eat-dog world and this patriarchal machismo view of reality, then that constrains how we act and how we behave. Social movements are created out of a contagious mood and a new tactic. Part of what that new tactic does is it wakes people up, and part of what that mood does is gets them to dream again.
In 2011, mass movements for change swept across the globe in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis.
There was a cycle of struggles, sometimes called the movement of squares, that starts in Tunisia and passes to Egypt, passing then across the Mediterranean to Spain, to Greece, before it finally arrives at Zuccotti Park in the United States. And what were these movements about? They were really about the demand for a new kind of democracy.
During Occupy Wall Street, we suddenly thought, what? We can have a democracy in this country that's not run by corporate finance capitalism? Like, it's amazing, you know? And the moment was so ripe that within 24 hours, activists in New York City took up the idea and ran with it. These movements were a kind of refusal of corporate culture, consumerism, and that was their essence.
The Occupy movement quickly spread from Zuccotti Park to cities across the United States and then the world.
The Occupy movement captured the feeling that ordinary working people had, that when the recession happened in 2008, the very banks that had caused the financial collapse were the ones being rewarded, and the rest of us had got sold out.
What was so important about Occupy was to crystallize the public anger. Occupy did that and put an explanatory narrative around the 99% versus the 1%.
We're just trying to figure out a way that we can change this system. An economic system that is fundamentally misaligned in the corporate interest and against the people's interest. And that's all we're doing. Hey, back up.
Occupy Wall Street was a constructive failure, but it taught us something very important. We need to pair protests with gaining sovereignty, which means either pairing protests with winning elections or pairing protests with winning wars. And you can choose as an activist. I would advocate elections.
There's only so many times you can have tear gas fired into your face and get hit over the head by a police baton or be dragged off to jail. And after a while you say, you know what, we're going to do something at the level of politics now. But all those movements faced the challenge, what do you stand for? Are you actually going to challenge the power of corporations? This is what the 2020s will be about.
We turn now to Seattle, Washington, where a former Occupy Wall Street activist is being sworn in today to the city council.
We have shown that it's possible to succeed as an independent, grassroots, openly socialist campaign, not taking any money from big business. This moment belongs to that way of organizing.
Sharma becomes the first socialist elected to the Seattle City Council since the early 20th century. Her signature issue was $15 an hour minimum wage.
There were courageous workers of McDonald's and other fast food outlets who went out on a one-day strike. 15 and a union was their slogan.
On the 15th of May, 2014, thousands of fast food workers flooded the streets of 150 U.S. cities, striking to demand a $15 minimum wage, better working conditions, and the right to form a union.
We organized ordinary people, workers, rank and file union members, and activists who wanted to fight for 15. If you're actually going to be true to the movement, if you're going to be accountable to all these people you claim to represent, once you're elected, it does require you to take a bold and strong stance against the corporate politicians. If they're not on your side, then you have to fight against them. You're duty bound. Of the over $1 billion of taxes that Amazon owes to the IRS, they now get a break of $789 million.
Her campaign wins so many supporters that Seattle becomes the first major city in America to adopt $15 an hour minimum wage. And that starts the ball rolling as more and more cities across the nation have followed the example of Seattle.
If you empower workers by giving them a better standard of living, it's not going to stop there. It raises their sight, the confidence of working people towards a different kind of society. You don't need a PhD in economics to know that your life sucks under capitalism, and we've got to build a movement to fight for it.
In 2019, Kshama Sawant was elected to a third term on Seattle City Council, despite Amazon spending $1.5 million to try to unseat her.
Kshama was pioneering the new urban renaissance. Starting around 2013 and 14 especially, a whole new movement developed of grassroots organizations from various movements that then united to elect for the first time representatives of their perspectives into office. You had a whole wave of people, all of whom were not expected to have a chance. All of them are running on more or less the same platform, that income inequality is the moral issue of our time. And they were not just part of a U.S. movement, but you had Siddiq Khan, the first Muslim elected to the mayoralty of London. You had Anne Hidalgo, a leading environmentalist and socialist of Europe, winning the mayoralty of Paris. Carmen Yulín Cruz, the mayor of San Juan, Puerto Rico. And you had Ada Colau in Barcelona. In the wake of the mortgage meltdown worldwide, there were thousands of Spanish homeowners being evicted from their houses by international banks. And Ada Colau begins to lead a resistance movement of the homeowners.
Fue una lucha muy dura, muy militante, a pie de calle, para parar los desalojos y para forzar a los bancos a negociar con las familias para que pudieran conservar su vivienda o como mínimo para que no se quedaran con una deuda de por vida.
¿Por qué hacen esto si no somos delincuentes? ¡Esta es nuestra casa!
¡Este desahucio lo vamos a parar! Through mass protests and civil disobedience, she gains a name for herself as a defender of the homeowners.
La plataforma de afectados por la hipoteca ha conseguido paralizar el desahucio de una familia que se iba a ejecutar esta mañana.
Aquí no pasa ningú! No pasa ningú! No pasa ningú!
Fins que no tinguem aquí el president de l'entitat, que entenem que ell sí que tindrà capacitat de decisió, nosaltres no marxem. Con unas administraciones secuestradas por los intereses financieros, los bancos o de las grandes corporaciones, fuimos muchos los que nos preguntamos, pues quizás hay que dar el paso para intentar ir a la institución a recuperar lo que es nuestro. Pues mucha gente nos planteamos si no había llegado el momento de intentar hacer una candidatura política para hacer que la política sea otra cosa mucho más democrática de lo que ha sido hasta ahora.
Gracias.
Llegó a ser la primera mujer alcaldesa de la ciudad de Barcelona. Llegáramos al gobierno de la ciudad, todos los poderes fácticos nos vieron como unos intrusos, que no teníamos en nuestra agenda los teléfonos de nadie, absolutamente nadie, de los habituales de los poderes económicos de la ciudad.
What's different about this movement is that the progressives have seen the necessity to actually capture office. Then also, once they get into office, they've understood the necessity for continuing to be connected to the grassroots movements that got them there.
Barcelona está liderando la lucha contra los desahucios respecto a cualquier otra institución que haya en todo el Estado español. Somos la ciudad que más inversión social hace de todo el estado.
In 2019, more than 200 leading thinkers and activists endorsed Colau's bid for re-election. Barcelona has become a beacon of hope, they wrote, proving that we don't have to be afraid of standing up to corporate power, that there is another way of doing politics that puts people at the center. Colau was re-elected mayor in June 2019.
Seeing the documentary The Corporation, it opened my eyes.
This is Chris Barrett. He appeared in our first film, featured as one of the first corporate-sponsored college students.
We saw Tiger Woods on TV with a hat with a Nike logo on it, and we figured, he probably gets like millions of dollars just to wear the hat on the press conference. And therefore, we figured we can do that for someone else and hopefully get money in turn so we can go to school.
You guys were poking fun at us, but we were 18-year-old kids. Seeing The Corporation, my mind just kind of exploded. It was just like, I had never been exposed to this mindset before. I was having lunch with my grandfather, and I asked him who should the Democratic nominee be, and he told me at the time that Bernie Sanders looks pretty good. I went home and I researched Bernie's platform, and I realized that internally, I align with a lot that Bernie says.
This great nation and its government belong to all of the people and not to a handful of billionaires.
When I got connected to Grassroots for Sanders, they offered me the position of assistant fundraising manager, where I could be able to do the fundraising asks on Reddit.